The Rise of Segregation, Unit 3, Movement to the World Power. Please pause the video and look at this picture and try to guess and try to evaluate what the author is trying to portray. Unit 3, The Rise to World Power and Racial Segregation. What is racial segregation? Racial segregation is the separation of a certain groups of people based on their race from one another to a group in daily life. Segregation can be whites and blacks, it can be Mexicans and Canadians, it can be anyone of different races, segregating one another from daily parts of life. After the Civil War is when segregation truly became known, despite the fact that it had been going on for years. Throughout the amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, segregation soon becomes legalized after being abolished. After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment is now in place. This is abolishing of slavery in all states of the United States. Next was the 14th Amendment, now adopted by the Constitution. This defined American citizenship. This prohibited the abridging privileges of citizens. It applied the due process, also known as the cause of the Fifth Amendment. As well, it guaranteed equal protection of the laws to all citizens, blacks and whites. The last slavery amendment was the 15th Amendment. This was now adopted into the Constitution as well. This gives U.S. citizens the right to vote, and voters cannot be discriminated based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Take a brief moment and pause and reflect. What issues did African Americans have to face after the Civil War? Please take time to do that now. After the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, the Southerners tried to avoid all three of those. They came up with things called the Black Codes. This was the United States passed laws. This occurred to the former Confederate states in the 1860s. Some examples of Black Codes are literacy tests to vote. Despite it saying that you can't discriminate, they now made it legal to where you had to pass a test to be able to vote. As well, you had to have a license to work, a license to be married, a license to have a weapon, to own property, etc. All these things that it was hard for most African Americans to have, seeing that they had just come from slavery, come from war, come from things that weren't allowing them the opportunity to have the literacy that most white Americans had. This then arose to a new thing called the Jim Crow laws. Please take time to note the definition. Jim Crow laws are laws that segregate African Americans and other white racial groups from white Americans. Some of these commonly segregated spaces are a result of Jim Crows were schools. Schools where you had to have a white and you had to have a black school in most towns. Public areas were completely different. You had different restaurants, you had different bathrooms, different water fountains as you see right there. This is the picture that you saw in the very beginning of the clip. Obviously, this is two water fountains. One on the left says white above it. The one on the right says colored. If you'll notice, which one looks nicer? Which one probably has colder water? And which one was probably cleaned the earliest? All those I think we'd all safe to say would be the white. Are they both water fountains? Yes. So they are separate. They are equally water fountains. But in all reality, are they equal? That is your judge. Some other examples of Jim Crow laws are buses. In Alabama, all passengers had to sit differently. Most of the times it was blacks in the back, whites in the front, all up until a woman named Rosa Parks decides to go against the grain, sitting up front, causing an uproar, again throwing us into something called as a civil rights. During this time period as well, restaurants were different. In fact, most restaurants, you could not even accept a black to come in. It was carry out only. Libraries in North Carolina, Libraries had to have completely different sections for blacks as for whites. Most of the time, you would see the black books would be the older ones, the dirty ones, the ones that most likely were completely out of date or torn. The teaching had to be different. A white teacher was not allowed to teach a black student. Black teachers were not even allowed to teach, except for their own black students. So if you think about it, you're having the illiterate teach the people who are going to be tomorrow without having anything. The schools were separated. As we said before, you have your black schools and you have your white schools. The prisons were even separated. You had a white and you had a black section of the prison for both eating and sleeping. Probably one of the most unique ones is the textbooks. In schools, textbooks went to the whites first. For instance, you have a textbook in the 1900s. You have a school, you use it for 10 years. Most likely it took a couple years to make that textbook, making it nearly 15 years old by the time it reaches a black boy's hands. The fact that literacy tests were in place was no mistake. The fact that they were illiterate was no mistake. It was a simple setup of makeup that the textbooks and the American people were setting upon the African Americans to hinder them to not become part of the world. Parks as well, they had to be separated as well. You have your whites had a section and blacks had a section, and no employer was allowed to even help out the black park. Lynching became very popular during this time period as well. Take note of the definition now. Lynching. To lynch means to put to death, usually by hanging, by mob action, without due process of law or legal sanction. This term was coined in the 1830s after William Lynch, a young boy, was brutally attacked and killed. He was hung for no apparent reason. Many types of people were lynched throughout history, from outlaws in the American West to immigrants in the American cities. But it wasn't until the vast majority of lynching victims became known as African American men that this common term became known. Between 1882 and 1968, the peak of segregation, mobs lynched 4,743 people. That's known in the United States. Over 70% of them were African American. By the late 1920s, 95% of U.S. lynchings occurred in the South. By 1950, lynchings virtually disappeared due to the anti-lynching efforts headed by the NAACP. It wasn't until people finally started taking note of the horrible actions that were taking place that lynching and different acts of segregation became widely known and widely respected. Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 corresponds with the Jim Crow laws. If you take note, there is an African American and a white guy. The African American appears to be a traveler. He's up at the ticket booth. He asks, "One for first class ticket to Covington, please." The ticket holder says, "That'll be $2, mister." Then while we're in the car, you have the conductor coming up saying, "You've got to move to the colored-only car right now." The African American says, "Why? I have more white ancestors than I even have black." But if you note, the sign above the man says whites only. Now we're looking at the cop. The cop comes up to him and says, "You've broken a Louisiana segregation law." The black man replies, "What have I done?" Now we're in the judge. We're in the court session now. The judge rules. The state laws now state that the railroad must set up separate but equal facilities for white and colored races. They have done that. Was he in a train? Was he allowed to be in a train? Yes, he was. So the black man now says, "This is unfair. I've been denied my equal rights." This entitles Plessy versus Ferguson. The Jim Crow laws are now legal. Therefore, the Supreme Court rules them segregation is legal. Separate but equal. We always were separate. We just forgot the equal. The NAACP worked hard to bring horrors of lynching in American people to justice. From the writings of Ida B. Wells in The Crisis, these writings became known. The Ku Klux Klan, also known as the KKK. Take note of the definition now. The Ku Klux Klan is a white supremacist group originating in the South after the Civil War. The KKK is responsible for countless acts of terrorism, violence, and lynching, all intended to intimidate, murder, and oppress African Americans, Jews, and other minorities. People like this were hired people such as Harry Truman, Harding, senators, governors, and representatives. The fact that people of that kind of honor would be in such a group was outrageous to many, but favored by some. Most of the times, it even got them elected. Here are some pictures of the lynching that was taking place. If you notice, it's all white people looking at the black young boy. Then on the bottom right, you see a picture of the KKK. The KKK then performed one of the first films to ever be shown in the White House, known as The Birth of a Nation, showing that portraying of white American Southerners as heroes, getting rid of all the African Americans in the South. This was shown by Woodrow Wilson. Now let's talk about the people. Ida B. Wells was an African American woman who was ahead of her time in many ways. She spoke for women's rights as well as African American rights. Speaking up for truly what she believed in, she is a woman highly favored and highly respected in the entire time period of the progressive movement into today. Frederick Douglass was a widely regarded leader and spokesman for the black community. He was a pacifist. He was then succeeded by Booker T. Washington in Douglass's roles. Douglass's debates were highly known about many people during this time period. His differing ideas of how black Americans should deal with racism and lack of the opportunity was highly known. Booker T. Washington was a journalist himself and proclaimed black man whose ideas to gain freedom was more passive, though his thoughts were social equality. Then there's W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a very active activist in proceeding with protests such as active in the KKK member of anti-colored people. His actions usually got him the negative view. The two both, Washington and Du Bois, had the same idea. They just had completely different ways of going about it. Most of the time making Du Bois mostly hated and Washington more favored. However, it was through the acts of them both that eventually segregation started coming to an end. Washington was taken to the White House through Roosevelt and Taft. His search for social equality was to work with the social rights economic process. He wanted progress, not sudden change. Whereas Du Bois, he wanted to act out until the action was actually taken to consideration. Washington's idea of segregation was a second-class citizen to be accepted. Or Du Bois, he believed that they should have equality in everything right away. Washington then, civil rights would become for whites and blacks to prove themselves already. He believed that the whites wanted the blacks to prove themselves. When Du Bois simply believed that blacks should not wait for the witness to accept them, but to become accepted immediately. The civil rights versus the human rights is a highly controversial issue. It's an example of the right to bear arms versus the right of food and water. Our civil rights are things that we should be able to do by government, and our human rights are inherited rights that people have. The civil rights versus human rights are what issue us into the segregation itself. Segregation moves on to progressive movement because segregation is simply a progressive part. The fact that segregation happens after the Civil War is none other than a proof that America was not ready to become what it was. Moving on to imperialism next lesson. This is the wrap-up of segregation. Now answer these questions on your own.